Picture this. You're 28, sitting in a sterile medical office, about to sign away the most intimate part of yourself to a stranger. The contract on the table is worth $500,000. Your mother is dying. You have no other choice. But then something happens that no one, not you, not the billionaire across from you, not anyone, saw coming. The pen felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Sarah Davis's hand. $500,000. The number burned in her mind like a neon sign as she stared at the surrogacy contract spread across the mahogany table. Around her, the Manhattan medical suite hummed with expensive efficiency, leather chairs that cost more than her rent, abstract art that probably funded someone's college education, windows offering million-dollar views of Central Park. But all Sarah could see was her mother's face 3 weeks ago, oxygen mask covering her mouth, eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes when you realize you're running out of time. Stage 4 lung cancer. 6 months, maybe less without treatment. $200,000 for surgery. $300,000 for the experimental therapy that might give her 2 more years. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the contract. 28 years old, art degree she'd never used, 3 part-time jobs that barely kept their Chicago apartment's lights on. This was it. This was her mother's only shot. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. As I was saying, Miss Davis, given your unique medical history, he paused, glancing at the file. We'll need to take extra precautions during the preparation phase. That's when David Richardson looked up from his phone. Really looked. His storm-gray eyes found that single line in Sarah's medical file, the line she'd hoped would get buried in pages of blood tests and psychological evaluations. The line that made her cheeks burn with something between shame and defiance. Patient has never been sexually active. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Like the air itself had stopped moving. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His manicured fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals without flinching, began tapping against the leather armrest. Twice. Then stopped. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through Dr. Martinez's clinical explanation like a blade. "Did you say unique medical history?" Sarah's spine went rigid. Here it comes, she thought. The judgment. The questions. The inevitable moment when Chicago's most eligible bachelor decides the virgin from the South Side isn't worth the complications. But David didn't look at her like she was broken or naive or somehow less than. He looked at her like she was a person. A real, complicated, deserving of respect person. And that's when he said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Cancel the procedure." Stop right there. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Think about the last time someone truly saw you, not what they wanted from you, not what you could do for them, but you. Your worth. Your dignity. Your right to make choices without selling pieces of your soul. Can't remember? Neither could Sarah. And that's exactly why what happened next will make you believe in love again. The pen clattered to the floor. Sarah watched it roll under the examination table as Dr. Martinez sputtered about timing and preparation and legal obligations. The nurse froze mid-motion. A tray of instruments suspended in her hands like a pause button had been pressed on the entire world. But David Richardson, 6'4", worth $2.8 billion, featured on Forbes covers for his ruthless business acumen, sat perfectly still, his attention focused entirely on the woman across from him whose world had just imploded. "Sir, I don't understand," Dr. Martinez said, shuffling papers frantically. "Everything's been arranged. The legal team, the medical protocols, the timing is perfect. I said cancel it." David's voice carried the kind of authority that had built empires and destroyed competitors. But when he looked at Sarah, his tone softened to something almost gentle. "All of it." Sarah's throat constricted. 26 weeks of planning, of steeling herself, of pushing down every instinct that screamed this was wrong, gone in 5 seconds. "So that's it?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "My medical history disqualifies me?" David leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The movement brought him closer, but somehow made her feel less trapped, not more. "No," he said quietly. "Your medical history makes you invaluable. And I'm not the kind of man who takes something invaluable from someone who's only offering it out of desperation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not because they hurt, but because they were true. And because no one, had ever called her invaluable before. Dr. Martinez opened his mouth to protest again, but David's raised hand silenced him. "Everyone out," David said. "Now." They obeyed. Of course they did. When you're worth more than some country's GDP, people tend to listen. The door clicked shut, leaving Sarah and David alone in a room that suddenly felt enormous and intimate at the same time. Sarah didn't shrink. Despite every instinct her mother had taught her about powerful men and their expectations, she held David's gaze. "If you're uncomfortable with this arrangement, just say so. I'm not here for pity or charity." "I know you're not." David stood, his height imposing but not threatening. "Which is why I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly." Sarah's chin lifted. "Ask." "If money wasn't an issue, if your mother's treatment was fully covered, if you never had to worry about rent or groceries or choosing between medication and utilities, what would you do with your life?" The question blindsided her. When was the last time anyone had asked what she wanted instead of what she needed? "I don't understand the relevance." "Humor me." Sarah stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the hidden price tag. She found none. "I'd paint," she said finally. "I'd illustrate children's books. Maybe design murals for community centers. I'd create things that made people feel less alone." David nodded slowly. "You went to art school." "For 6 months. Until my mother got sick." "And you've been working 3 jobs since then to pay for her care." It wasn't a question. Sarah wondered what else was in that file, how much of her struggle had been reduced to clinical notes and financial records. "Someone has to," she said simply. That's when David did something that would replay in Sarah's mind for months afterward. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "Jennifer? It's David. I need you to wire $200,000 to Chicago General's billing department." "Yes, today? Patient account for Grace Davis." "No, it's not a business expense, it's personal." Sarah's legs went weak. "What are you doing?" David ended the call and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm buying you time." "Time for what?" "To decide what you actually want. Not what you need to survive, but what you want to build." Sarah felt tears prick the corners of her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She didn't cry. Not in front of strangers. Not in front of men who could buy and sell her problems without checking their bank balance. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "Yes, you can. Because it's not charity, Sarah. It's recognition." "Recognition of what?" David stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of silver in his dark hair. "Recognition that some things in this world are sacred. And a woman's first experience of intimacy, the choice of when and how and with whom, that's sacred. I won't be the man who takes that from you, no matter how much I want a child." "Hold on. Let me ask you something. How many times have you been in a room where someone with all the power chose to give it up to protect your dignity? How many times has someone seen what you were willing to sacrifice and said, 'No, you're worth more than this'?" If your answer is never, then you understand exactly why Sarah's hands were shaking. Why her carefully constructed walls were starting to crumble. Why she was about to make a decision that would either save her or destroy her. 3 days later. Chicago's South Side. A world away from Manhattan penthouses and billion-dollar handshakes. Sarah stared at the check on her kitchen table, crisp, official, with David Richardson's signature scrawled across the bottom in confident black ink. $200,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire life, sitting between a stack of overdue bills and her mother's pill organizer. Grace Davis sat across from her, oxygen cannula resting at her nostrils, but her eyes sharp as ever. Despite the illness ravaging her body, Grace hadn't lost the maternal radar that had guided Sarah through 28 years of life in one of Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. "So let me understand this," Grace said, her voice raspy but strong. "This billionaire canceled a $500,000 contract to protect your virtue, then paid for my treatment anyway?" Sarah nodded, still processing it herself. "Baby," Grace continued, "either this man is a saint, or he wants something from you that's worth more than money. Maybe he's just decent, Mama." Grace laughed, a sound that had become precious since her diagnosis. "Honey, I've cleaned offices for rich men for 30 years. Decent ones are rarer than unicorns." Sarah traced the edge of the check with her finger. David had called twice since their meeting, both times just to check on Grace's condition and see if Sarah needed anything. No pressure, no hidden agendas, no mentions of their disrupted arrangement. "He gave me his personal number," Sarah said. "Told me to call if I need anything." "And what do you need?" It was such a simple question, but Sarah realized she'd forgotten how to answer it. For 6 years, since Grace's first diagnosis, every decision had been about survival. What could they afford? What treatment could they access? What sacrifices were necessary? When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted? "I need to understand why," Sarah said finally. "Why what? Why he walked away from something he clearly wanted? Why he's helping us? Why he looked at me like—" She trailed off. "Like what, baby?" "Like I mattered. Not what I could give him, but me." Grace reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. Her fingers were thinner now, marked with 4 bruises, but her grip was firm. "Then maybe it's time you found out." Sarah's story starts long before that medical office. It starts in a cramped apartment where dreams go to die, where a 9-year-old girl watches her father walk out the door without looking back, where a mother works 3 jobs and still comes home singing because she refuses to let poverty steal her daughter's hope. But somewhere between childhood and survival, Sarah stopped believing she deserved more than just getting by. Sound familiar? The Art Institute of Chicago acceptance letter was still in Sarah's dresser drawer, folded and faded but never thrown away. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd unfold it and read the words that had once felt like magic. "We are pleased to offer you admission to our Bachelor of Fine Arts program, along with a partial scholarship based on the exceptional quality of your portfolio." She'd been 18, young enough to believe that talent and determination could overcome circumstances. Her art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had helped her put together a portfolio that showcased 6 years of drawings, sketches of her neighborhood, portraits of people waiting for buses, murals she'd imagined painting on the sides of buildings. "You have a gift, Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez had said. "Don't let anyone tell you that art isn't practical. The world needs people who can show us beauty we didn't know existed." For exactly 4 months and 13 days, Sarah had lived in that world. She'd walked through the Institute's halls surrounded by other dreamers, learned about color theory and composition, started planning a series of paintings about resilience in urban communities. Then Grace collapsed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made headlines or attracted sympathy. She'd simply crumpled in the hallway of an office building she was cleaning, her mop bucket clattering across polished marble while she struggled to breathe. The diagnosis came swift and brutal: lung cancer, stage 2, probably caused by years of exposure to cleaning chemicals in poorly ventilated buildings. Sarah withdrew from school on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she was working her first job, answering phones at a dental office for $12 an hour. By the following Monday, she'd added a weekend shift at a grocery store and started applying for a third job. Dreams, it turned out, were a luxury she couldn't afford. But she kept the letter, kept her art supplies in a box under her bed, kept drawing in stolen moments between shifts, as if her hands could remember what her heart had forgotten. This is where most stories would tell you that Sarah was a victim of circumstances, that life was unfair, that she deserved pity. But here's what makes Sarah different from every other struggling artist you've ever met. She never once complained. She never asked, "Why me?" She never let bitterness poison her spirit. Instead, she built armor out of dignity and weapons out of determination. She became the kind of woman who could walk into a billionaire's office and negotiate her own terms, even when she had nothing left to bargain with except herself. And that's exactly the kind of woman who could bring a man like David Richardson to his knees. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away in a Manhattan penthouse that costs more per month than most people make in a year, David Richardson stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Central Park while his assistant, Jennifer, ran through his schedule for the week. Breakfast meeting with venture capitalists, lunch with senators, dinner with investors from Tokyo. His life was a masterclass in efficiency, every moment optimized for maximum return on investment. Every person he met wanted something from him: money, connections, access to power. Every conversation was a transaction disguised as small talk. But for 3 days, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about a woman who'd asked for nothing except the right to make her own choices. "Sir?" Jennifer's voice cut through his thoughts. "The car will be here in 10 minutes for your meeting with." "Cancel it," David said. "Sir?" "Cancel the meeting. Cancel everything for today." He turned away from the window. "I'm going to Chicago." Jennifer blinked. In 5 years of working for David, she'd never seen him cancel a meeting, let alone an entire day of commitments. "Should I arrange the jet?" "No," David said, already reaching for his coat. "I'm driving." 7 hours later, David Richardson, the man who'd built a technology empire worth billions, who'd been featured on magazine covers as the Midwest mogul, stood outside a small cafe in Chicago's South Side, more nervous than he'd been since his first board presentation. Because this wasn't about business. This was about a woman who'd reminded him what it felt like to want something that couldn't be bought. Rose's cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh hope. Sarah arrived first, choosing a table by the window where she could watch the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood: kids walking home from school, elderly men playing chess on the corner, women balancing grocery bags, and toddlers with the practiced grace of professional multitaskers. When David walked through the door, every conversation stopped. Not because anyone recognized him, though his tailored coat and expensive shoes marked him as clearly out of place, but because he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that made people look twice. Sarah watched him scan the cafe until his eyes found hers, watched his shoulders relax when she smiled. This man, who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, looked genuinely nervous about having coffee with her. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Thank you for driving 7 hours to drink coffee that's probably not up to your usual standards." David glanced around the cafe, at the mismatched furniture, the handwritten menu board, the photos of neighborhood families covering one wall. "Actually, it feels perfect. Real. As opposed to fake? As opposed to performed," David said. "Most places I go, everyone's either trying to impress me or extract something from me. This feels like people are just living their lives." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of condescension or tourist curiosity. She found neither. Just genuine appreciation for something most wealthy people never bothered to notice. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. Why did you really come here? And don't say it's just to check on my mother. You could have done that with a phone call." David was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into coffee he hadn't tasted yet. When he looked up, his gray eyes held something vulnerable. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about what you said in that office." "What did I say?" "That you weren't there for pity or charity. The way you held your ground when everyone else in the room, including me, had more power than you. The fact that you were willing to sacrifice something precious to save someone you love, but you refused to pretend it didn't matter." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That bothers you?" "It humbles me," David corrected. "I've spent my whole life around people who'll sell anything for the right price. Their integrity, their relationships, their values. But you were willing to make an impossible sacrifice while still maintaining your dignity. I've never met anyone like that." "You don't know me well enough to idealize me," Sarah warned. "I know you kept your art school acceptance letter in your dresser drawer for 10 years. Sarah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "How could you possibly?" "Because I had my people do a background check," David admitted. "Not for business reasons. Because I wanted to understand who you really are. What shaped you into someone who could walk into that office and negotiate from a position of no power while never losing her sense of self-worth." Sarah set down her cup carefully. "You investigated me. I researched you. There's a difference." "Is there?" David leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Sarah, I've built my entire career on reading people, on understanding what motivates them, what they're hiding, what they really want. Most people are fairly predictable once you know their pressure points. And me. You're the first person I've met who seems motivated purely by love. Not fear, not greed, not ambition. Just love for your mother and respect for yourself. That's—" He paused, searching for words. "That's extraordinary." Sarah felt her carefully maintained walls begin to crack. "What do you want from me, David?" "I want to know if you'd let me take you to dinner. Somewhere nice, but not intimidating. Somewhere we can talk without medical equipment and legal contracts and all the complications that brought us together." "This is a date request?" "This is a man asking a remarkable woman if she'd like to spend an evening getting to know each other without any agenda beyond seeing what might be possible." Sarah looked at him across the small table. This billionaire who'd driven 7 hours to drink coffee in her neighborhood, who'd researched her dreams instead of her credit score, who was asking permission instead of assuming privilege. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. Okay, David Richardson. You can take me to dinner. But I choose the place." His smile was radiant. "Deal." That dinner changed everything. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. David didn't try to impress Sarah with expensive restaurants or exclusive venues. Instead, he let her take him to Maria's, a family-owned Italian place where the pasta was homemade and the owner's grandmother still worked the register. He didn't talk about his money or his success. Instead, he asked about her art, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from neighborhood politics to her favorite books. And when the evening ended, he didn't assume anything. He walked her to her door, thanked her for one of the best nights he'd had in years, and left without expecting anything in return. That's when Sarah realized she was in trouble. Because this wasn't a man trying to buy her attention or wear down her defenses. This was a man genuinely interested in earning her respect. And that was far more dangerous than any contract she could have signed. 3 weeks of dinners. For phone calls that lasted past midnight. 2 visits where David helped Grace with her physical therapy exercises and somehow convinced her to let him cook dinner in their tiny kitchen. Sarah was falling and she knew it. Not the desperate, grabbing onto anything that floats, kind of falling that happens when you're drowning. The slow, deliberate, choosing to trust kind of falling that happens when someone proves, day after day, that they see your worth. The realization hit her on a Thursday evening as she watched David help Grace to the couch after her treatment, his movements gentle and respectful, his conversation focused entirely on what Grace wanted to talk about, not what impressed him about his own life. "You know," Grace said after David had left, "I've been waiting 30 years for a man to look at you the way that one does." "How does he look at me?" "Like you hung the moon and painted the stars. Like you're the answer to questions he didn't even know he was asking." Sarah curled up beside her mother on their worn couch. "I'm scared, Mama." "Of what?" "Of believing this is real. Of letting myself want something I might not get to keep." Grace took Sarah's hand in both of hers. "Baby, you can't protect yourself from hurt by refusing to feel joy. That's not living, that's just surviving. And you've been surviving for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to live. What if he changes his mind? What if this is all some elaborate setup, and 6 months from now he decides he's done playing with the poor girl from Chicago? Then you'll handle it the same way you've handled everything else life has thrown at you," Grace said firmly. "With dignity, strength, and the knowledge that you deserve better. But Sarah, don't rob yourself of happiness today because of fears about tomorrow." That night, Sarah called David. "I need to see you," she said without preamble. "Are you all right?" "Is Grace?" "We're fine. I need to see you." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When David arrived at Sarah's apartment that night, he found her sitting on the front steps despite the October chill, wearing a sweater that had seen too many winters and an expression he couldn't read. "Walk with me?" she asked. They walked through her neighborhood in comfortable silence, past corner stores and bus stops, past murals painted by local artists and gardens tended by people who'd learned to grow beauty in small spaces. Finally, Sarah stopped under a streetlight and turned to face him. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I'm not looking for someone to save me," Sarah said, her breath visible in the cool night air. "I've been saving myself for 28 years, and I'm pretty good at it by now." David nodded, waiting. "But I'm looking for someone who sees that I don't need saving and chooses to stand beside me anyway. Someone who respects my strength instead of trying to fix my struggles." "Sarah, I'm not finished." Her voice was steady but intense. "I need you to know that if we do this, if we try to build something real, I won't be grateful in the way you might expect. I won't spend every day thanking you for lifting me out of poverty or giving my mother a chance at life. Those are things you chose to do, and I appreciate them, but they're not why I would choose you." David stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "Why would you choose me?" "Because you listen when I talk. Because you ask about my dreams, not just my problems. Because you helped my mother with her exercises tonight not to impress me, but because you saw she was struggling and you wanted to help. Because when you look at me, I don't feel like a project or a conquest or a good deed. I feel like a woman worth knowing." The streetlight cast shadows across David's face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the silver at his temples. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "You are worth knowing. You're worth everything good that could happen to you and more than I probably deserve. But Sarah, I need you to understand something too." "What?" "I didn't help your mother to win points with you. I didn't research your dreams to manipulate your feelings. I didn't drive to Chicago because I was bored or curious or looking for a challenge." He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I did all of those things because the moment I saw you in that office, something in me recognized something in you. And I haven't been the same since." Sarah felt her breath catch. "What did you recognize?" "Home," David said simply. I recognized what it feels like to want to protect something precious, to build something meaningful, to choose love over logic. He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. I recognized what it feels like to want to be worthy of someone extraordinary. Standing there under the streetlight, surrounded by the familiar sounds of her neighborhood, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to rescue, but the quiet certainty of someone who'd found an equal. David. Yes. Kiss me. He did. Slowly, carefully, like she was something precious he'd been waiting his whole life to hold. And for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she might deserve something beautiful. That kiss changed everything. Not because it was perfect, though it was, but because it was honest. No desperation, no transaction, no hidden agenda. Just two people choosing each other. But here's where the real story begins. Because falling in love is easy. Building a life together? That's where most fairy tales end and real life begins. What happened next tested everything Sarah and David thought they knew about love, trust, and what it means to protect someone you can't bear to lose. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in November. Sarah was making breakfast when her phone started buzzing with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Chicago woman's surrogacy deal with tech billionaire takes unexpected turn. David Richardson cancels $500,000 contract to protect woman's virginity. From desperation to romance, the unusual love story of a billionaire and his would-be surrogate. Sarah stared at her phone screen in horror as dozens of news alerts flooded in. Photos of her leaving Rose's cafe with David. Speculation about their relationship status. Her mother's medical history laid out in clinical detail for public consumption. Her private struggle, her most vulnerable moment, her family's pain, all of it packaged as entertainment for strangers. David's call came before she could process the full scope of the disaster. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm flying to Chicago right now. Don't talk to any reporters. Don't leave your apartment. Don't. How? Sarah interrupted, her voice barely controlled. How did they find out? I don't know yet. Someone at the medical office, maybe the agency. My legal team is investigating. Your legal team. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course, you have a team for everything, don't you? Including cleaning up the messes you create. Sarah, that's not. I'm hanging up now. Please don't. Let me explain. Sarah ended the call and turned off her phone. Then she sat on her couch and stared at the wall, trying to figure out how her life had become a headline. By noon, there were reporters outside Sarah's building. By evening, the story had gone national. By the next morning, Sarah Davis, the woman who'd spent her whole life avoiding attention, protecting her privacy, maintaining her dignity, was the subject of think pieces about modern romance and exploitation. Some painted her as a victim, others as a gold digger. None of them saw her as what she actually was. A woman who'd made an impossible choice out of love and found herself thrown into a spotlight she never wanted. But the worst part wasn't the media attention. The worst part was the doubt that crept in during the long, sleepless hours after David's calls went unanswered. What if this had been his plan all along? What if she'd been played by the most sophisticated manipulation she'd never seen coming? David showed up at Sarah's door at 6 a.m. the next morning, looking like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from the overnight flight from New York. I know you don't want to see me, he said when Sarah opened the door. But I need 5 minutes to explain. Sarah stepped aside to let him in, but her body language was pure defense. Arms crossed, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The same posture she'd worn in that medical office, but this time it felt like armor against him instead of protection with him. Explain what? How your personal life became a media circus. How my mother's private medical information is now public record. How I went from being a person to being a story overnight. David ran his hands through his hair. I don't know how it leaked. I swear to you, Sarah, I would never. Wouldn't you? Sarah's voice cut like a blade. Think about it from my perspective, David. Rich, powerful man meets struggling woman. Cancels business deal in dramatic fashion. Swoops in to save the day. Takes her on romantic dinners, meets her family, makes her feel special. And then, conveniently, the story goes public right when she's starting to trust him. Perfect publicity for the benevolent billionaire who chose love over profit. David stared at her, and Sarah watched something break in his expression. You think I orchestrated this, he said quietly. You think I've been manipulating you from the beginning. I think I've been naive, Sarah replied. I think I wanted to believe that someone like you could actually care about someone like me without an agenda. But this... She gestured toward her phone, still buzzing with calls from reporters. This looks a lot like an agenda. Sarah, please. I want you to leave. Let me prove it to you. Let me show you that this isn't what it looks like. How? With more money? More gestures? More perfectly timed rescues? Sarah shook her head. I don't know what's real anymore, David. And I can't afford to keep guessing. David stood there for a long moment, looking like a man watching everything he'd ever wanted slip through his fingers. If I go, he said finally, if I walk out that door right now, will you at least keep the money? For your mother's treatment? Whatever you think of me, Grace doesn't deserve to suffer because I failed you. It was exactly the right thing to say, and that made Sarah angrier. See, she said, even now you're being perfect. Even when I'm breaking up with you, you're being noble and considerate and making it impossible for me to hate you completely. It's exhausting, David. I can't tell if you're genuine or just incredibly good at this. David moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I've been falling in love with you since that first day in the medical office. Not with your story, not with the idea of saving you, but with you. The woman who could look at a room full of powerful people and maintain her dignity. The woman who loved her mother enough to sacrifice everything but never lost sight of her own worth. The woman who taught me that real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing what you're worth and refusing to settle for less. He opened the door, then looked back one final time. I'm sorry I failed to protect you from this. You deserved better. And then he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in her apartment with tears on her face and a hole in her chest where hope used to live. 3 days passed. 3 days of avoiding phone calls and ignoring knocks at the door. 3 days of Grace asking gentle questions and Sarah giving shorter and shorter answers. 3 days of Sarah telling herself she'd made the right choice, that protecting herself was more important than risking her heart on someone who might not be what he seemed. But on the 4th day, something happened that changed everything. Grace was the one who found it. Sarah had been hiding from the world for 4 days when her mother hobbled to the mailbox and found a thick envelope addressed to Sarah with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. I thought you should see this before you decide what to believe. Someone who worked at the medical office has been selling celebrity patient information for months. David had nothing to do with the leak. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. Dr. Martinez. Sarah stared at the flash drive for an hour before finally plugging it into her laptop. What she found made her stomach drop. Email threads between a medical office receptionist and a freelance journalist. Payment records for information about celebrity patients. Screenshots of medical files being sold to gossip websites. And David's name on a list of victims, not conspirators. The receptionist had been selling information for 8 months. David wasn't the mastermind behind Sarah's public humiliation. He was just another person whose privacy had been violated for profit. But there was more on the flash drive. Video footage from the medical office security cameras showing the receptionist photographing files after hours. Phone records proving she'd contacted journalists immediately after David and Sarah's consultation. Bank deposits that lined up perfectly with story publication dates. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the evidence of David's innocence and her own terrible mistake. He hadn't manipulated her. He hadn't orchestrated their meeting or leaked their story for publicity. He'd simply been a man falling in love who'd gotten caught in someone else's scheme. And she'd accused him of everything she'd been protecting herself against her entire life. "Baby." Grace's voice was gentle from the doorway. "You okay?" Sarah looked up with tears streaming down her face. "I destroyed it, Mama. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too scared to trust it." Grace sat beside her daughter on the couch. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know if there's anything I can do. The things I said to him, the way I looked at him like he was everything I'd been warning myself about." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Would you forgive someone who accused you of manipulating them when all you'd done was love them?" "Depends," Grace said. "Would they have good reason to be scared?" Sarah thought about her life before David, the years of men who'd seen her struggles as opportunities, the offers that came with conditions, the help that always had hidden prices. "Yeah," she admitted, "they would." "Then maybe the question isn't whether he'll forgive you," Grace said. "Maybe the question is whether you're brave enough to ask. What does it take to fight for love when you've spent your whole life learning to fight against it?" Sarah was about to find out. Sarah had never been on a plane before. She sat in coach on the 6 a.m. flight to New York, clutching a folder containing copies of everything Dr. Martinez had sent her. Her hands shook during takeoff, not from fear of flying, but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. She was going to show up at David Richardson's office without an appointment, without warning, without any guarantee that he'd even see her. She was going to apologize for the worst accusation she'd ever made and hope that the man who'd shown her unconditional respect might find a way to forgive her conditional trust. The taxi ride from LaGuardia to Manhattan cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a week, but Sarah didn't care. Every mile brought her closer to either redemption or final closure. Richardson Technologies occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Midtown. Sarah walked into the lobby in her best jeans and the blazer she'd worn to their first meeting, feeling underdressed and overdetermined. "I need to see David Richardson," she told the receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "Mr. Richardson doesn't take unscheduled meetings. If you'd like to schedule, tell him Sarah Davis is here." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, recognition, maybe curiosity about the woman from the headlines. She picked up her phone. "Mr. Richardson? There's a Sarah Davis here to see you." "Sir, I'll send her up." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt longer than the flight from Chicago. When the doors opened, Jennifer, David's assistant, was waiting with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "He's in his office," Jennifer said. "Fair warning, he hasn't been sleeping well." Sarah nodded and walked down a hallway lined with awards and magazine covers featuring David's face. At the end was a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a door that stood slightly ajar. She knocked once and pushed it open. David sat behind his desk, but he looked nothing like the composed billionaire she'd first met. His hair was disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie nowhere to be seen. Dark circles under his eyes suggested Jennifer's warning about sleep had been an understatement. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered across his face, hope, quickly replaced by careful neutrality. "Sarah." His voice was professionally courteous, but she could hear the hurt underneath. "This is unexpected. I know. I should have called, But I thought you might not take my call, and I needed to see you." She held up the folder. "I needed to show you this." David gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please." Sarah sat and opened the folder, spreading the evidence across his polished desk. Email printouts, bank records, security footage screenshots. All of it pointing to a medical office receptionist who'd been selling celebrity patient information for months. David studied the documents in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. "Where did you get this?" he asked finally. "Dr. Martinez. He'd been investigating the leak and wanted me to know the truth before." Sarah's voice caught. "Before I did something irreversibly stupid." "Like what?" "Like accusing the man I'm falling in love with of manipulating me when all he'd ever done was respect me." David's hand stilled on the papers. He looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes, and Sarah saw everything she'd been too scared to trust before: vulnerability, hope, love that hadn't died despite her doubts. "Sarah." "I'm not finished," she said, echoing words she'd spoken to him weeks ago under a different streetlight in a different world. "I need you to know that what I said to you, what I accused you of, it wasn't really about you. It was about every man who'd ever looked at my situation and seen opportunity instead of a person. It was about every offer that came with conditions, every kindness that had a price." David nodded slowly. "I know. But that's not an excuse. You never gave me any reason to doubt your intentions. You never made me feel like a transaction or a project or a charity case. You saw me, David. Really saw me. And instead of trusting what I felt when I was with you, I let my fears convince me that something so good couldn't be real." "Your fears were justified," David said quietly. "Given your history, given the circumstances we met under, you had every reason to be cautious." "But not with you," Sarah said. "Not with the man who canceled a contract to protect my dignity. Not with the man who drove 7 hours to have coffee in my neighborhood. Not with the man who helped my mother with her exercises because he saw she was struggling, not because he was trying to impress me." She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "I love you, David. Not because you saved my mother, not because you have money, not because you're safe. I love you because when I'm with you, I remember who I am underneath all the survival instincts. I love you because you make me want to be brave instead of just strong." David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was memorizing it. "What are you asking for, Sarah?" "A chance to prove that I can trust you the way you've trusted me. A chance to build something real without waiting for it to fall apart. A chance to love you without reserving part of myself for when it goes wrong." "And if it does go wrong? If we try this and it doesn't work?" Sarah reached across the desk and took his hands in hers. "Then we'll have tried. We'll have been brave enough to choose love over fear. And maybe that's enough." David's fingers tightened around hers. "I missed you," he said simply. "Every day for the past week, I missed you. I missed you too. So much it felt like missing a part of myself." David stood and walked around the desk, pulling Sarah to her feet. When he cupped her face in his hands, his touch was gentle but certain. "If we do this," he said, "if we try again, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when you get scared, and you will get scared because this is scary, you'll talk to me instead of running away. Promise me you'll give us a chance to fight for each other instead of fighting against what we're building." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." When he kissed her, it tasted like forgiveness and second chances and the kind of love that's strong enough to survive its own growing pains. That kiss in David's office changed everything. Not because it erased the hurt or fixed the trust that had been broken, but because it proved that some things are worth fighting for. But the real test wasn't whether they could forgive each other. The real test was whether they could build something strong enough to withstand the next challenge. And in their world, where privacy was a luxury and love was often treated as entertainment, the challenges were just beginning. 6 months later, a rooftop garden in Chicago, overlooking the city skyline. The same skyline Sarah had drawn as a teenager when she dreamed of painting murals that would inspire her community. Sarah stood at the edge of the garden, wearing a dress the color of midnight that David had helped her choose, though she'd insisted on paying for it herself. Below them, the city sparkled with lights and life, but all Sarah could focus on was the man beside her who'd somehow become her anchor in a world that had gotten much more complicated since their story went public. They'd been navigating media attention for months, carefully, deliberately, with the kind of strategic thinking that came naturally to David and the fierce privacy protection that came naturally to Sarah. They'd given one interview to a journalist they trusted, telling their story on their own terms. After that, they'd largely retreated from public attention, building their relationship in the spaces between headlines. Grace was in remission. Sarah had started painting again, working on a series about urban resilience that a gallery in the Loop had expressed interest in exhibiting. David had opened a satellite office in Chicago, claiming it made business sense but fooling no one about his real motivations. They'd been happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way that felt both fragile and unshakable. So when David dropped to one knee in the middle of the rooftop garden, Sarah's first instinct wasn't joy, it was panic. "David, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done months ago," he said, pulling out a ring box that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Sarah Davis, will you marry me?" Sarah stared at the ring, a perfect solitaire that caught the city lights and threw them back like captured stars, and felt her world tilt sideways. "We've talked about this," she said carefully. "We agreed we didn't need marriage to prove what we have." "We don't need it," David agreed. "But I want it. I want to stand in front of everyone who matters to us and promise to love you for the rest of my life. I want to give you my name if you want it, or take yours if you prefer. I want to make it legal and official and permanent because, Sarah, you are the only future I can imagine wanting." Sarah looked at the ring, at David's hopeful face, at the city spread out below them like a promise of possibility. And she said the last thing either of them expected. "I need time to think about it." The silence that followed was deafening. Not just because David hadn't expected that response, but because Sarah hadn't expected to give it. This was David Richardson, the man who'd proven his love in a dozen different ways, who'd respected her boundaries, supported her dreams, loved her mother like his own. The man who'd forgiven her worst fears and helped her build a life she'd never dared to imagine. So why did the thought of marrying him make her feel like she was suffocating? Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her apartment, the same apartment she'd kept despite David's gentle suggestions about moving somewhere larger, somewhere safer, somewhere more befitting their combined circumstances. At 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep and called the one person who'd always been able to cut through her confusion with surgical precision. "Mama? I know it's late, but—" "Baby, what's wrong?" Grace's voice was instantly alert. "Did something happen with David?" "He proposed." Grace was quiet for a moment. "And you said no." "I said I needed to think about it." "Same thing. What's got you scared?" Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small in the dark. "What if I'm not ready? What if I mess this up the way I messed up before? What if—" "Sarah Michelle Davis," Grace interrupted, using the full name that meant business. "Stop that right now." "Stop what?" "Stop looking for reasons to sabotage the best thing that's ever happened to you. That man loves you exactly as you are. He's proven that in every way possible. So what's really going on here?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Grace started to worry the call had dropped. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah finally whispered. "Everything good in my life has been temporary, Mama. Daddy left. My art school dreams ended. Your first remission didn't last. I keep thinking that if I get too comfortable, if I want this too much, it'll be taken away. Oh, baby, Grace's voice was soft with understanding. You think that if you don't fully commit, it won't hurt as much when it ends. Doesn't it? No, honey. It just means you never get to fully live it while it's here. Sarah wiped tears she hadn't realized were falling. What if I'm not brave enough for this? You are the bravest person I know, Grace said firmly. You've been fighting for everyone else's happiness your whole life. Maybe it's time to fight for your own. The next morning, Sarah did something she hadn't done since she was 18. She called in sick to all her jobs and spent the day painting. Not the careful, controlled sketches she'd been working on for months, but wild, emotional paintings that spilled across canvas like visual prayers. She painted her fears, dark, twisted shapes that looked like abandonment and loss. She painted her hopes, bright, soaring colors that looked like possibility and joy. And finally, she painted David. Not his face, but his essence. Strong, steady strokes that felt like safety. Warm colors that felt like home. Light that cut through darkness without overwhelming it. When she stepped back from the easel, she realized she'd painted her answer. Sarah found David in his Chicago office the next evening, working late as usual. He looked up when she knocked, and she could see the careful hope he was trying to hide. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He didn't move from behind his desk, giving her space to say whatever she'd come to say. "I've been thinking about your proposal." And? Sarah walked into his office and closed the door behind her. She'd worn the dress from the night before, the midnight blue one that made her feel beautiful and strong at the same time. "I've spent my whole life waiting for the worst-case scenario," she said. "Planning for abandonment, preparing for disappointment, protecting myself from pain by never fully investing in joy." David nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "But you know what I realized?" Sarah continued, moving closer to his desk. "The worst-case scenario already happened. I almost lost you because I was so busy protecting myself from hurt that I created the hurt I was trying to avoid." She reached into her purse and pulled out something that made David's breath catch, the ring he'd offered her the night before. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life preparing for the worst," Sarah said. "I want to spend it building toward the best. With you. As your wife, if you'll still have me." David stood so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Are you sure?" "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "But I'm sure. I love you, David Richardson. I love your patience with my fears, your respect for my independence, your ability to see my strength without trying to fix my struggles. I love the way you help my mother without making it about you, the way you've never once made me feel like I owe you anything, the way you make me want to be brave instead of just careful." David walked around his desk and took the ring from her trembling hands. "Sarah Davis," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you marry me? Not because it makes sense or because it's expected or because it's the next logical step, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include waking up next to you every morning and choosing to love you new every day." "Yes," Sarah said, laughing through tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll choose you. Yes, I'll be brave enough to build something beautiful with you." When he kissed her, it tasted like promises kept and futures chosen and the kind of love that's strong enough to survive its own growing pains. They were married 4 months later in Grace's hospital room, not because Grace was dying, but because she'd insisted that any wedding worth having should happen where love was strongest. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly. David wore a navy suit with a boutonniere made from flowers Sarah had grown in the community garden she'd started in their neighborhood. The guest list was small: Grace, Jennifer, Dr. Martinez, Rosa from the cafe, and a handful of neighbors who'd watched Sarah grow from a scared young woman into someone who glowed with quiet confidence. But the love in that room was enormous, filling every corner with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing two people choose each other completely. Today, Sarah Richardson stands in front of the Grace Davis Center for Women's Empowerment, cutting the ribbon on a building that will serve their community for generations. She's no longer the desperate young woman who walked into a medical office willing to sacrifice everything for her mother's survival. She's the founder of a nonprofit that has helped over 300 women find paths to independence. She's an artist whose work hangs in galleries and community centers across Chicago. She's a wife who learned that love doesn't require perfection, just honesty and the willingness to keep choosing each other. Most importantly, she's a mother. The little girl sleeping peacefully in David's arms during the ribbon-cutting ceremony will grow up in a world where her parents' love story isn't a fairy tale. It's a blueprint. A guide to what's possible when two people see each other clearly, respect each other completely, and choose to build something beautiful together. Sarah and David's story isn't perfect. They still fight sometimes, about money, about work-life balance, about whether their daughter should go to private school or stay in their neighborhood public school. Sarah still gets scared sometimes, still has moments when she braces for abandonment that never comes. David still struggles with wanting to solve problems that Sarah needs to work through herself. But they've learned that love isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of commitment to work through conflict together. It's the choice to see each other's fears and flaws and choose connection anyway. It's the daily decision to build trust through small actions rather than grand gestures. Their love story began with a contract that valued Sarah's body but ignored her worth. It nearly ended when fear convinced Sarah to reject the very love she'd been seeking. It found its strength when both of them learned that real love isn't about taking what you want, it's about giving what's needed. Today, 5 years after that first meeting in a sterile medical office, Sarah and David have built something rare and precious. A love that honors both partners, a partnership that makes both people stronger, a family that will ripple outward through their community for generations. This is what love looks like when it's built on respect instead of need, trust instead of fear, choice instead of circumstance. This is what's possible when someone sees your worth and chooses to honor it, when someone offers protection without demanding payment, when someone gives you the space to choose them freely rather than out of desperation. In a world that often tells us we must trade pieces of ourselves for survival, Sarah and David's story offers hope. That there are people who will see our worth and choose to protect it, that there are loves worth waiting for, and that dignity, once lost, can be found again in the hands of someone who truly sees us. So here's my question for you. What would your life look like if you stopped accepting love that required you to be less than you are? What would change if you held out for someone who saw your strength instead of your struggles, who wanted to stand beside you instead of save you, who respected your boundaries instead of trying to cross them? Sarah's story reminds us that we don't have to choose between love and dignity, between connection and independence, between being supported and being respected. The right person will give us all of these things not because we've earned them through suffering, but because we deserve them simply by being human. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink yourself to fit someone else's needs. Real love doesn't require you to trade your worth for security. Real love sees you fully and chooses you completely, not despite your complexity but because of it. The world needs more love stories like Sarah and David's, stories that show us what's possible when we refuse to settle for less than we deserve, when we build relationships on mutual respect instead of mutual need, when we choose partners who make us more ourselves instead of less. Your story is still being written. Your love, the kind that honors your worth and celebrates your strength, is still out there. Don't settle for anything less than someone who sees you the way David saw Sarah, as someone invaluable, deserving of protection, worthy of the kind of love that builds you up instead of breaking you down. This isn't just a story about surrogacy or billionaires or medical drama. This is a story about what it means to value yourself enough to wait for someone who values you too. This is a story about the courage to be vulnerable with someone who's proven themselves worthy of your trust. This is a story about building love that lasts because it's built on the right foundation. What story are you ready to write? What love are you ready to fight for? What kind of partnership are you brave enough to build? The choice, as always, is yours.